Hi guys, Sean here from digiDirect. Today we're going to be talking about the new Panasonic S1 and S1R, their new full-frame mirrorless cameras that will be out within the next few months. Now this is Panasonic's first foray into full frame, which is something that people have been waiting for quite a while now. Now I'll be sharing my photos and videos that I shot with these cameras. One big upfront caveat is that while these are production model cameras, they are running pre-production firmware. So notably image quality and particularly autofocus performance may not be indicative of final production results. But there's a lot to talk about. This may be a bit of a longer video, so let's jump right into it. So the S1 and the S1R both have identical body design other than the badging, so we'll use the S1R here as a model. First thing, while it is a mirrorless camera, it ain't small. Panasonic is aiming these cameras primarily at a high enthusiast or pro market, and as such they aren't making compromises on size. It's not obscene, but it's definitely bigger than an EOS RP or Nikon Z6, for example. The build quality though on this is stellar. It's a fully weather sealed camera, it looks and feels like a tank, and I fully expect that it's able to receive a pretty good beating. I'd say the build quality easily surpasses Sony, Canon, and Nikon's mirrorless options. I've always found Panasonic's control layout to be quite intuitive. It's the same here. Everything's placed quite intelligently. There's a few bells and whistles. There's a great AF joystick. There's a physical drive dial, button illumination, and a top LCD panel. Panasonic continues to improve their menu system as well, and in conjunction with the My Menu setup and 3 custom spots on the mode dial, there's a lot of customization you can do on this camera. Let's talk about the viewfinder. My God. Both cameras, the S1 and the S1R, both have a 5.7 million dot viewfinder in them. And for comparison's sake, most competitors top out at about 3.69 million dots. It's just a dream to shoot with, really, really good. They also both have dual card slots, which neither the Canon EOS R or Nikon Z7s have. One of them is a UHS 2 compatible SD card slot, the other is an XQD card. We've got mic and headphone jacks, HDMI, USB-C, and a remote port. There is a new battery that's rated for 400 shots. I found the battery performance to be pretty decent. It's not as good as the legendarily long battery life from the GH4 and GH5, but it is a pretty good performance. You can also charge it via the USB port. Finally, there's the LCD screen, which is high resolution, but puzzlingly, they've decided to go with this strange, partially articulating design, but you can't flip it out and all the way around. Considering Panasonic's video pedigree, this seems like a bit of a miss. For example, I'm shooting this video on my GH4 and I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have that articulating screen so I could see myself in the frame because I'm shooting these videos by myself. Now, rather than make a new lens mount, Panasonic has partnered with Leica and Sigma to adopt Leica's L mount. So Panasonic has 3 lenses at launch, the 24-105 f4, 70-200 f4, and 50mm f1.4, and any Leica SL lens will also fit on here natively. Panasonic says that they'll have 7 more lenses by the end of 2020, but I think the real gem here is that Sigma is going to have 14 lenses for this system by the end of 2019. This is going to be mainly their Art Series Prime lenses that they've been recently porting to Sony E-mount. I think that this is huge for the growth of this system. These Sigma Prime lenses are best in class, and I think having a whole bunch of them available within the year is a massive coup for Panasonic. Now, that's all in the future. I was using the Panasonic brand lenses to shoot this video, but just bear that in mind when evaluating the breadth of this system. So the main difference between the S1R and the S1 is the sensor. So they both have full frame sensors, of course, but the S1R has a 47 megapixel sensor, while the S1 has a 24 megapixel sensor. And this is a relationship we've seen quite a bit recently, like the Sony A7R III versus the A7. That does mean that the S1R is going to be a bit more niche. It's going to be aimed more at stills photographers who want that super high resolution, while the S1, being lower resolution and less expensive, is going to be more applicable for general use and video work where that high resolution is not required. Also note, the S1 has lower pixel density than the S1R, which means it is going to be a little bit better in low light performance. Now, I think the picture quality coming out of both these cameras is fantastic. They're super sharp images, very high quality, especially on the 51.4, getting that beautiful shallow depth of field that Lumix shooters have wanted for a long time. And that applies to video as well, which we'll touch on later. But I just thought the picture quality here was really, really high. Very, very good marks. Note both cameras do have a high res mode, which will take 8 images shifted by a pixel and then blend them all together. On the S1R, that results in a 187 megapixel image, and on the S1, it's a 96 megapixel image. So you can still get super high resolution shots even on the S1. You do have to use a tripod to do that. You're not gonna be able to shoot it handheld, but it's a good option if you need a super high res shot here and there. So similar to Panasonic's recent Micro Four Thirds releases, the S1 and S1R have an IBIS system that's a combination in-body and lens stabilization. So just in body, it's rated at 5.5 stops. So if you've got an adapted lens or a lens with no IS, you can expect 5.5 stops. When you combo with the lens that has Panasonic's IS in there, you're going to get 6 stops, so a little bit higher. But it does quite a good job at the stabilization here. Here I'm shooting at 200 millimeters handheld, freestanding, and that's pretty solid considering the focal length that I'm shooting at here. It's also, good enough that if I've got a wide angle lens here, I can do some kind of walking shots. Also, of course, very good for photos, let you shoot at lower shutter speeds for darker conditions. So a number of these low light shots here, I was shooting around 1/15 of a second or so here and still turned out good quality. So a very good implementation on their system here. We've seen it in some of their other cameras, but it's a critical feature these days, and I think they nailed it on this camera. Now let's jump over to video, because that's always been a strength of Panasonic's. Now they definitely are wanting these cameras to appeal to still shooters, not just video, but they still have packed quite a few video features in here. Both cameras can shoot up to 4K 60 frames per second, which are the only ones of these full-frame mirrorless cameras so far to be able to do that. If you're regularly shooting video in 4K, like I do, for example, being able to shoot slow-mo without having to drop in resolution is a big deal. That's really, really nice to have. Note the S1 does have a bit of a crop. It's got a 1.5 times crop at 4K 60 only. The S1R does not have that crop. Neither cameras have a crop at up to 4K 30. So it's only when you jump into slow-mo that you get that crop, and it's not on the S1R. You can also shoot at up to 180 frames per second in 1080p. So if you're shooting some really slow-mo stuff, you can do that. When you jump above 120 frames per second, you do get a bit of a crop in both cameras. It's marginal though, it's a lot less than the 1.5 times from the 4K 60. So here's where the S1 is gonna start to differentiate itself, however. So the S1 has a record limit of 30 minutes in 4K 60, but no record limit in 4K 30. In comparison, the S1R has a 15-minute limit in 4K 60 and a 30-minute limit in 4K 30. The S1 also has some extra picture profiles not in the S1R, namely the hybrid log gamma picture profile. And the S1 is also going to be receiving a paid firmware update later in 2019 that the S1R won't be receiving. In this firmware update is going to be Panasonic's Vlog picture profile, as well as it's going to unlock the ability to shoot 10-bit 422 internally at up to 4K 30 and 10-bit 422 externally up to 4K 60, so if you've got an HDMI recorder plugged in. Both cameras have all of the small but important video-centric features that Panasonic has honed over the last couple of years, like focus peaking, zebra stripes, monochrome live view, night mode, time-lapse, and so on. So now let's talk about one of the most controversial topics, autofocus performance. And I'm going to put big caveat quotes around here that this is pre-production firmware, can't necessarily draw final conclusions because this is not necessarily indicative of final performance. So we'll just have to be discussing it, and we'll have to wait for conclusions for a later video once production firmware is available. Now Panasonic, the reason why this is somewhat controversial is because Panasonic is keeping the DFD system from their Micro Four Thirds lineup. That system has received some criticism in terms of AF performance in the past. So the camera, or Panasonic said that they have a 0.08 second response time in this camera, which is quite fast, although not quite as fast as, for example, the Sony a6400, which is 0.02 seconds, the Canon EOS RP, which is 0.05 seconds. So fast, but not the fastest on the market. It also has eye autofocus, so it's going to focus on your subject's eye, not just their face, so that's very good. Overall, I found the autofocus performance was okay. I think it did a serviceable job much of the time. Often could keep up with what I needed. Certainly if I'm just doing portraits or studio kind of work, this would be no problem. There were some instances with faster moving subjects or some of the video autofocusing where it didn't, it did miss some shots or sometimes would lose the subject for video AF. But I don't think the system is garbage. Like I said, I think it's quite serviceable. In fact, I think it has a lot of potential. Like I said, a lot of times it did a great job. There's only sometimes that it dropped the ball. So I think if Panasonic in the final firmware can increase the consistency of the system, I think it'll be very good. I don't think it's ever going to be a camera that you're going to sell based on the autofocus performance. But on the other side, I don't think I would turn someone away from this camera for that reason either. So I think it's serviceable. It's not the highlight of the camera. Like I said, pre-production firmware, so that's about as far as I can take it here. Hopefully and presumably the performance will be a little bit better in the final production firmware. But we're just gonna have to wait and see, but I am cautiously optimistic. Both cameras can shoot at up to 9 frames per second with autofocus lock, or up to 6 frames per second with AF tracking. And the buffer for raw photos on the S1R is 40, and on the S1 it's 90. Now both cameras of course have Panasonic's 6K photo mode, which means you'll be shooting 6K video from which you can extract an 18 megapixel resolution shot. So that lets you shoot at 30 frames per second, so you can get quite fast when you're shooting that. The trade-off is it's a lower resolution image, but in a pinch, that does a good job as well. Overall, there's a lot to like about the Panasonic S1 and S1R. I think they're both excellent entries into the full-frame market for Panasonic. While they're not light cameras, they are built like tanks. They can totally take a beating. Got a lot of nice little ergonomic features on here, dual SD card slots, fantastic viewfinder. The image quality coming out of this camera both cameras are very, very high with that beautiful full-frame sensor, of course, as well. In-body image stabilization system is very effective. It's full of Panasonic's best-in-class video features. And as I mentioned, I cannot overstate the importance of those 14 Sigma lenses natively going to be on the L mount coming before the end of the year. I think that's huge. I do think that the higher price point and higher resolution of the S1R is going to make it the more niche option, whereas the lower resolution, lower price point, and improved video features on the S1 is going to make it the more popular of the two models. Now you can pre-order either camera on our website at www.digidirect.com.au, or if you're watching this video after the cameras have come out, feel free to visit us in store where you can test it out for yourself. We've got stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, the Brisbane and Melbourne CBD, and Cannington, Western Australia, which is just outside the Perth CBD. Thanks guys, take care.